Well, hello. Today I would like to talk to you about Mexican Americans and the Chicano identity and Chicano culture and literature. First of all, we refer to Mexican Americans um, as the Americans of Mexican ancestry. These are the people of the United States who have a Mexican ancestry. They are the largest Hispanic group in the United States, and they have been there, particularly in states like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and California, and also in some areas of the Midwest, like cities like Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis, are some of the places where there are more Mexican American communities in the United States. But particularly in the Southwest, they have been there ever since the time of the Spanish colonies in the 16th century. Some other terms that are important to keep in mind is Tejanos, which refers to the descendants of the Spanish colonizers in what is now Texas, and also the Californios, which is a term that was used particularly in the 19th century to refer to Spanish-speaking residents of California. Some of them were of Mexican descent and some others were of directly Spanish descent, but these are some terms that we should keep in mind. Now, the relationship between this original Mexican Americans and what is now the United States has been a difficult one. These territories, original like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, originally belonged to Mexico. And in the 1830s, there was a westward spread of Anglo settlers that ended up outnumbering the Spanish settlers in the area. So in 1848, there's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is a result of the Mexican-American War, in which the United States ends up taking control over what was formerly Mexican territory: California, Texas, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, as a result of the Mexican-American War, which means that the Tejanos, the Texans, and the Californios lost the war and ended up becoming part of the United States. In the 1850s, the former Mexican citizens were disenfranchised. That means they were deprived of their rights, and they also lost their land to the Anglo settlers in the Anglo-United States. Now, they also started from that point, they started to campaign for voting rights, which was a very long process. They also manifested against educational and employment discrimination. On an account of being Spanish or Mexican, they were discriminated against for many decades. They also struggled to define and maintain their identity, and we're going to discuss this briefly in a minute. And they undergo an ongoing search for social and economic advancement that even today is a relevant part of their identity and their reality. Now, in the late 20th century, there's a great movement, especially in the 60s and 70s. And it was during this time that we also had the civil rights movement, in which the African Americans were also fighting for their rights, where the Mexican Americans, or the Chicanos, also joined the fight with a very strong nationalistic idea, because they haven't lost their identity or their touch with their roots, as they consider themselves the original peoples of Southwestern United States. You know, those territories that previously belonged to Mexico and ended up becoming part of the United States. So they're still very much attached to the land, and they consider it their own particular nation. And we're going to talk about this also in a minute. So they struggle a lot for identity too during this time, trying to find the proper name to use to identify themselves. There's the idea of Latino, Mexican American, Hispanic. The problem with Latino and Hispanic is they have a very strong European connotation. You know, as descendants of Spanish settlers, whereas Chicano is a term that connects them to their original indigenous identity, right? The indigenous peoples that inhabited the land before they were colonized, first by the Spanish and then by the United States. Also the Chicano culture struggles a lot between the two extremes of integrating into the mainstream American society or separating from the mainstream American society. So there's a huge question too that is present in their cultural manifestations and in their reality, in their social reality. And so another, point of struggle is the opposition between the earlier generation Mexican Americans, the descendants of the indigenous peoples that originally inhabited the land, versus the more recent immigrants from Mexico that have moved to the United States with their families and have had children there. So not all of them identify with the concept or the idea of being a Chicano, but all of them are Mexican Americans, regardless of how long they've been in the United States or their families have been living in the United States. Of course, they suffered a lot, and they suffer still today a lot from discrimination, but especially on account of their ethnicity, their race, their culture, their Spanish language, right? If you were heard speaking Spanish, then you were discriminated against. Many of Mexican Americans today don't even speak Spanish anymore, but there was a very strong discriminatory association to the usage of the Spanish language in the United States. Also, there were immigration raids in which many Mexicans were repatriated and deported back to Mexico. And I think this is a point of struggle that remains even today, especially in the Trump era, right? With the wall on the border to separate Mexico from the United States. So it's a huge issue that still causes a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. Families have been separated, and a lot of discrimination has also taken part. Some stereotypes is that the Mexican Americans are disloyal. There are murders of white people and white police officers, particularly on account of 1940s newspapers and crime novels that depicted them as criminals. Also, they participated in World War II as part of the United States Army, but even though they served in the military units, many of them were denied medical services veterans. So they came back from the war and they weren't treated in the same way as white veterans were treated. So this is also another form of discrimination. In the public school system, especially in the southwestern United States, there used to be mestizo or mulatto schools, Mexican schools that took mestizo or mulatto children, and they were sent there and separated from other schools. And of course, the quality of their education was inferior. Also, extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan also targeted. They were intimidated. They suffered from violence and harassment from white supremacist groups in the late 20th century. Now, Chicano in particular, Chicano is an American of Mexican descent. So in that sense, it's synonymous of Mexican American. However, it is more connected with the indigenous people of North America, like Native Americans, especially in the southwestern region of the country. So the Chicano term connects Mexican Americans to their indigenous ancestry. They identify themselves with this region, a legendary Aztec region that supposedly is located where the states of Colorado, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, California, Texas, New Mexico are today. And they have a very strong attachment to this area that they call Aztlan. That's like their original nation, the nation of Aztlan. So Chicanos identify themselves with this legendary nation, and much of their identity and their culture represents some desire to return to this land where they actually are physically, but not politically and spiritually even. So they have very strong connection to this land. Some characteristics of the ethnic identity of the Chicano: they are a historical and ethnic point of reference for Mexican Americans. The term Chicano was used to try and eliminate negative connotations because it was originally used as a pejorative term, just like the same way Negro was used very aggressively against African Americans, but then African Americans reappropriated the term Negro and they use it to identify themselves. In the same way, Chicano has become a term of positivity and political and social struggle, and that's why they identify with the term. In the 1960s, as already mentioned, there was a strong fight to reassert their civil rights, and Chicano term is also very closely associated with this fight. They rediscover their heritage through the use of the Chicano term. And today, we can say that a Chicano is a politicized Mexican American. So a Mexican American may not identify himself or herself as Chicano simply because they don't have the same political agenda, or they don't identify politically with the struggles. Whereas if a Mexican American acts politically and speaks up, in terms of their identity and their social and economic struggles, then that's a Chicano. It's a politicized Mexican American. I love this quote by Bruce Novoa: a Chicano lives in the space between the hyphen in Mexican American, trying to emphasize the ambiguity of the Chicano identity. You're not Mexican, you're not American, you're right there in the hyphen, you're in between. And this in-betweenness is what characterizes the Chicano culture. So there is a Hispanic culture, US-born Mexican child. This is kind of how we define and identify the Chicano identity. There's a mixture of cultures. There's a struggle to be accepted into the Anglo-dominated society of the United States because of ethnic, racial, linguistic barriers and differences. And also there's a sense of maintaining culture and identity. So a Mexican child that is Hispanic cultured, but born in the United States and identifies himself or herself with the original indigenous groups that inhabited Southwestern United States, then that could be a definition of a Chicano person. Some important Chicano authors: Sandra Cisneros, the author of The House of Mango Street, which we are reading. Rodolfo Anaya, who wrote Bless Me Ultima, another important novel. Gloria Saldúa, a very important Chicana writer, she published this book, Borderlands, La Frontera de Nu Mestiza, that actually establishes much of what it means to be Chicano. And also some authors like Josefina Lopez, a playwright. She wrote Real Women Have Curves. And Gary Soto, who is famous for his poetry and young adult children's books. So for now, this is it. Please prepare your questions and comments so we can discuss them in class. And I hope that these will prove useful to you. See you next time.